Now, understand something. I'm not making an argument for the pros or cons of fighting the Vietnam War. I'm merely illustrating a point about modern asymmetric warfare. The lesson of the Tet Offensive is when fighting the West, you don't defeat their military. You win their electorate. And the way to do that is through the institutions which shape culture in the West, namely Hollywood, the media, and academia. If Hamas had decided to engage in a conventional military attack directed at only legitimate military targets, the IDF would have effectively destroyed their warfighting capability within days, and Hamas knows it. So they engaged in asymmetric strategy. Once we understand this, their actions on October 7th, as horrific as they are, begin to make more sense. Hamas didn't just target civilians because they were easy targets or because they despised Jews, although both of those things are true. The attack and the subsequent taking of hostages was actually designed to elicit a major response from the IDF. But why? Well, maybe it's because to achieve their strategic objectives, Hamas needs civilian casualties. And more specifically, they need Palestinian civilian casualties. And this is why. The two entities in this conflict that lose the most from a greater peace agreement in the Middle East are Iran and the terrorist organizations they support. Upsetting this process requires much more than the random launching of rockets into Israel or strikes against legitimate military targets. The IDF is more than capable of handling such incursions, and the Israeli people have become all too accustomed to weathering such attacks without demanding an overwhelming military response. Something more significant was required, and October 7th created the kind of conditions that demanded a significant and sustained response. They needed something so obscene that Israel would have no choice but to hit back hard. And this is where the second component of Hamas's strategy plays out: how to get Palestinian casualties. Any government actually worried about civilian casualties dedicates resources to evacuating their own civilians from hostile areas and attempts to separate the civilian population from legitimate military targets. So what conclusion should we come to when a governing body decides to do the exact opposite? In this asymmetric environment, Hamas is not only incentivized to kill Israeli civilians, they are incentivized to maximize their own civilian casualties in the short run in order to elicit Western intervention on their behalf. As easy as it might be to explain Hamas's strategy away as nothing but mindless bloodlust, it is actually more sinister than that. Hamas is responding to the incentive structures certain elements within the West have created. Hamas understands that the real battlefield is not in Gaza, but in the streets, university halls, and newsrooms of the West. And so that is their target. And while a ceasefire seems like a humanitarian response to the tragic death of civilians, leaving Hamas intact as an operational and governing body will ultimately just reinforce that the perverse incentive structure remains the same. And that while the West may claim to not negotiate with terrorists, they always seem to force Israel to as soon as it becomes politically inconvenient for them. So here's the hard reality. If you actually want to achieve anything resembling a lasting peace in this part of the world, you're never going to achieve it by creating conditions where terrorists are incentivized to hurt both the civilians of their enemies and their own in order to achieve their political objectives.